And we are back. Thank you for joining us. This is the InfoWars Nightly News. I'm Darren McBreen, and I have a question for you. How do you feel, or what do you do when you see a police car in your rearview mirror? Do you feel safe, or do you feel threatened? And what were you to do if a police car were to pull you over? Do you know your rights? And we are joined now by Eddie Craig from Rule of Law of Radio. And he's going to break down some of the do's and don'ts, what you can and can't say, or what you shouldn't say when you're pulled over or confronted by law enforcement. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Let's start from the beginning. Flashing lights in my rearview mirror, getting pulled over. What are my rights at that point?
Well, your rights don't ever change. Whether you're being pulled over or not, the rights we have are inherent, unalienable rights. They belong to all of us. What we have to do is know what they are and when to invoke them in the presence of our public servants. When this police officer is initiating a traffic stop, he is operating under certain presumptions. One, that you are actually engaging in a regulable activity known as transportation. He got that premise based upon the fact that you have inspection stickers and license plates on your car. Because of that, he feels he has the authority to enforce these transportation regulations against you as a matter of course. Now, when you're pulled over, the last thing in the world you want to do is engage the officer in conversation. He is not your friend. Now, that's not to say he's a bad guy, but his job is to gather information and evidence for the purposes of his criminal investigation. And if he can engage you in conversation and get you to willingly and knowingly divulge information in a voluntary manner, then he is free to use that information against you later in a court of law.
And do they try to trick you into that as well? I mean, they know that better than you do, so they try to get you to divulge as much information as possible.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's exactly why it is a very fatal mistake as far as your case would be and your defense would go to engage in loose conversation with the officer.
Sure.
He is trained to interrogate. He is trained to ask questions that will make them seem innocent enough that you see no harm in answering them, when in fact exactly the opposite is true. A good example would be the terminology they use to describe what you were doing. I noticed that your vehicle was being operated at an excess speed. Right there, he has attempted to get you to admit on the record that, one, you were operating a vehicle. Those terms are specifically related to the acts of transportation, which is a commercial activity. And what he's doing is he is leading you down the rosy pathway of admitting that you're engaging in the activity, even if you aren't. But since most people take words and phrases with which they are readily familiar and presume that they understand their meaning when they hear them, no matter the source, their mistake is that presumption. A term or phrase used in law will almost never have the same meaning that you or I are commonly familiar with. In fact, it's a 100% guarantee that if a word or phrase is defined in statutory law, then it absolutely is not being used in the common and ordinary manner. If it were, there would not be a reason or need to redefine it, now would there?
Well, okay, what about this, though? But they start asking you questions. The first thing they ask, may I see your license, registration? Do you ask them, am I suspected of a crime? Or you have the right to say, why did you pull me over?
Well, there are several things you can say, and in my classes I teach people to basically, until they learn the concept, they are to ask 3 questions and 3 questions only. The first one being, what is the emergency and how can I help? The reason for that question is very simple. The officer has activated his MARS lighting system, which I say stands for More Annual Revenue System. But he uses that to declare an emergency reason for why he's stopping you. So our question is innocent enough because we're not going to presume or assume that we did anything wrong. We didn't. He's trying to enforce a statute against us that only applies to certain classes of people in a regulable activity, and we're not in that activity. So his attempt to regulate us is out of hand anyway. So we didn't violate anything that we should feel guilty about. So that first question is asked to set that tone. The second question you ask is, am I under arrest? Now, the reason for that is you want the officer to tell you whether you are or you aren't, or you are or aren't under arrest. And the reason there is simple enough. The courts say that these officers can pull you over for the purpose of an investigative detention. Well, I don't see that in the Fourth Amendment anywhere, but that's how they want to do it. So going by the court's declaration, we then come to the point of asking, am I under arrest, to get the officer to attempt to give him an opportunity to admit that we are. Texas law is very clear. Chapter 543 of the Transportation Code calls these traffic stops a warrantless arrest, and that the officer may only release the person arrested from custody if the person will sign a promise to appear on the citation. So there's no question the officer is lying to you when he says, no, you're in an investigative detention. And most of them know they're lying. Now, the third question is, am I free to go? The officer should never be able to give you the same answer to question 2 and question 3. They're a complete contradiction. You can't be not under arrest and also not free to go. The main reason we asked that question is to set the stage to prove on the record that we are actually in a custodial arrest. The courts have ruled that when a reasonable individual feels that he is no longer free to leave of his own volition, that constitutes a custodial arrest. So we're trying to establish those facts in the record. Now, the fourth thing you can ask is very simple, or the fourth statement, actually. Officer, is there a recording being made of this incident? And generally, they're going to tell you yes. And say, okay, then for the record, what I would like to tell you is, 1, I am not engaging in transportation or commercial use of the highways in any way, shape, or form. 2, I absolutely do not consent to being stopped for those purposes or any other purposes unless you can show that I've violated some law other than allegedly a transportation law. By doing that, we're actually setting the stage for the argument that the officer was fully informed that he was attempting to regulate me in a manner that was inappropriate. I was not acting in the regulable activity of transportation or commerce, therefore his authority to act under those statutes didn't exist. It's very much like someone trying to hold you accountable under a commercial fishing statute when you live in Iowa and you've never been to the coast to commercially fish in your life.
Well, in your experience, I mean, I would imagine this would catch a lot of officers completely off guard and by surprise. Are they more likely to listen and do they get more angry, or do they listen to you?
That actually entirely depends upon the officer. Nowadays, you just don't know.
That's why I asked. I would imagine some of them would get a little...
Yeah, some of them will get agitated. They'll get downright angry in some cases simply because you are attempting to enforce your rights. They're going to start making demands. I told you I wanted your license, registration, and proof of insurance. But again, officer, 1, I believe I'm in a custodial arrest because I'm not free to leave. 2, is any of that information that you can use to either further charge me or use against me in a court of law? Now, the officer's going to he's really going to explode at this point, at least as far as an attitude, simply because he's used to being obeyed without question. That's what they want you to be. They want you to be submissive. They want us to be sheeple. And I decided a long time ago I was no longer going to be that. And
what about when they ask, they always want permission to search your vehicle?
Again, use of the term vehicle, I would not recommend.
Okay.
Search my car, search my conveyance, automobile, sure, but not a vehicle. Again, vehicle is a commercial term related to transportation. But as far as the power to search, again, this is a warrantless arrest, therefore it would be a warrantless search. What is the officer's articulable probable cause to conduct that search? The courts will allow the officer to search what they consider to be the passenger compartment of an automobile if you're inside the car to ensure that the officer is safe from any attack by a weapon you may have hidden, which is my general rule and reason for when I'm pulled over, I immediately look for a private parking lot, a private driveway, somewhere other than the shoulder of the road to pull over. That serves multiple purposes. The first one being it does not give the officer the authority to tow the automobile. The only way he can tow the automobile is if he can show that it was obstructing the public traffic or was being seized for evidence.
Let me ask you this. What if it takes you a while to find that point when they accuse you of running from the police officer? I mean...
I turn on, if I know I don't have a place where I can pull over immediately, then I will turn on my flashers. I will decelerate my car to a point where there's no question that I'm not attempting to evade anyone. I will wave in the rearview mirror and acknowledge it. and I'll be pointing off the side of the road to let them know that I'm just looking for a safe place to pull over.
That sounds good.
If you do that, then they're going to have a very tough time saying that you made an attempt to evade the police.
Sure.
And of course, their dash cam will show that.
Yeah, you're not going 80 miles an hour around the corner.
It'll show exactly what the speed is because the camera's recording all that. It will also show that you are waving acknowledgement to the officer and that you signaled him that you're going to pull over. So they're going to have a very hard time with their own video proving that you made no attempt to evade.
Okay, speaking of video, more and more people are taking cameras with them. They're driving with cameras or their cell phones, and they're capturing the police officers, you know, conducting their searches. And they, often enough, they will tell you, hey, turn off that camera. You can't have that camera on. What do you say to that?
I'd say if this is a public place, you are conducting an official duty, and I have every right to tape you in the performance of your official
and they've
duties.
got their dash cams, you know, recording and other recording devices recording every moment.
That's evidence they can alter later. If you have possession of evidence they can't touch, they can't fix that if they screw up during the stop.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, let's move to on foot. You're walking across the street, you're on a street corner, officer comes up to you, starts questioning you. You know, what's your name? What are you doing standing around here? Now what?
Officer, what's the purpose of this interrogation? Am I under any lawful obligation to respond or answer your questions? And let him know right up front that this is not going to be just an easy mark of I want, you give.
What if they want your identification and you don't have it, and they tell you that it's law, you're supposed to have identification with you at all times?
Then the officer is intentionally and knowingly misstating a law, and he is abusing the authority of his office. There are penal code statutes against that in Texas. They are abuse of official capacity, official oppression, and official misconduct. And they can, in some cases, result in the officer being prosecuted for felony acts. The abuse of official capacity, especially because the level of the offense is actually charged based upon the monetary value of all of the equipment he is using to commit that crime. So once he passes $1,500, it becomes a state jail felony. And we all know that police cruiser is way more than $1,500.
Mm-hmm.
So he runs the very serious risk of committing crimes even when he doesn't know it. But we need to know it so we know how to make the charge.
So you're actually using their own laws against them. I mean, later, this is something that once you record everything or you know the proper things to say, this is evidence that we could use later in court. Because I'm thinking, what a lot of times, you know, what do we do once we receive a summons or that we get ticketed, and then we're our rights at that point?
Well, our rights at that point are, one, to know whether or not we've been lawfully summoned. We also need to know what the ticket does and does not create a duty upon us for. The ticket is not a summons. A summons, by definition, is a judicial process, and a police officer is an executive officer. He has no authority to issue a summons. What it actually can be considered to be is simply an agreement that, hey, I will let you go if you will promise to appear in front of a judge later rather than forcing me to take you right now, which is the mandate if they do take you into custody. They're required by law to immediately take you before a magistrate. They normally will not do that. If an officer takes you directly to jail and there is no particular reason for him not to act with due diligence, such as an ongoing riot, an ongoing natural disaster, things of that nature, he is duty bound to immediately take you before a magistrate, because the officer never has the authority to incarcerate. He only has the power of arrest. Only a magistrate or judge can issue a commitment order ordering the incarceration of an individual in Texas, and pretty much any other state.
Wow, wow. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the unconstitutional, all the checkpoints that the federal agents have all across the country now. And a lot of these are border checkpoints, but they're 100 miles inland, or they're 100 miles away from the border itself. So you come driving up, and then they ask you, they want to know if you have any fruit or vegetables. They want to look in the trunks of your cars, and they want to search your vehicles, you know. So what do you do at this point? You pull up to a checkpoint. They ask you where you're going.
Where I'm going does not appear to be any of your business.
And then they want to search the trunk of your car.